Hi, I'm Only Nunes, and I'm here with Mr. Shakthi de Silva, who is a visiting lecturer of international relations. And yeah, so how have you been, sir?
Thank you. I've been fine. Thanks for inviting me here.
All right, it's a pleasure, sir. So we'll be speaking about Sri Lankan often finds itself kind of crosswords of big global events, and also with its economic shocks, climate change, and power rivalries in Asia. So, from your perspective, what do you think about how important is Sri Lanka in this case? And also, like when it comes to global shifts, how do you see is that the biggest opportunities or risk right now in Sri Lanka? So yeah, as I mentioned, like I could mention about an example where Maldives is playing like a big role right now. So what can Sri Lanka also do?
Sure. So Sri Lanka has often been categorized as a very important nation by small and great powers alike because of its location. In addition to its location, in the past, Sri Lanka has used its clout, its political clout, and the international stage in terms of resolving bilateral issues between nations as well. Our participation in the non-aligned movement, as well as United Nations, historically played a very important role in shaping global dynamics. In terms of the current situation today, we are in a very interesting world, what I would term as coming from Ian Bremmer, a G0 world, a world in which there isn't really a global superpower to dominate and influence affairs. And in this type of environment, Sri Lanka has a big role to play, particularly in terms of the image it presents to the rest of the world, as well as the foreign policy it adopts. You mentioned Maldives, and Maldives has played a very important role in the geopolitical scene stage. And I think Sri Lanka also has a very important role to play, particularly in navigating geopolitical shifts at the moment, because there's been an interesting change in perception and attitude, particularly between our Asian giants, India and China. You remember a few months ago, the two were not necessarily seeing eye to eye. And yet, very recently in Tianjin at the SCO summit, the two leaders were very much arm in arms. So Sri Lanka has to, I believe, take very close attention, pay very close attention to what is happening right now, but also manage its foreign policy in such a way that it benefits our national interests. And that's a very important role that Sri Lanka has to play today, particularly in a backdrop where we have American tariffs imposed on many countries. Now, we recently had a 44% tariff that was reduced to 20. So that too is a very important development that Sri Lanka should take maximum advantage of. And we're currently undergoing external debt restructuring, and our economy is gradually on the path of recovery. Taking all of this into account in terms of our domestic environment and the external environment, I believe Sri Lanka has a very important role to play on the international stage, but we must do so very effectively in the sense of calibrating our foreign policy in such a way that we manage our relations with great powers and, more importantly, further our national interests in a way that benefits everyone in Sri Lanka.
Okay. When it comes to Indian China dynamics, as you mentioned earlier, it's kind of being the I would say like the closest giants of Sri Lanka because like India and China, the kind of relationship that we swings between cooperation and competition, and like Sri Lanka in the middle of that. How do you think this India China dynamic situation would how does it would kind of give an impact on Sri Lanka's foreign policy, as you said earlier? And could you share kind of a casual or like an incident or an example where Sri Lanka were able to like handle it?
Okay, so as many of you might know, in terms of India and China, they are a major source of tourists. They are major trade partners in terms of the locations that we export from. They are also significant investment partners, and very important geopolitical allies in our region. And therefore, we need to build our relationship with both. Now, in terms of their own engagement in Sri Lanka, in the past at least, China has significantly focused on infrastructure development in the south of the country, India, particularly in the north. That has gradually begun to change as Chinese interests have begun to shift more towards the north and northeast in terms of investment projects. And India is also engaged in building up rapport with political parties as well. And that has been a recent development that's quite interesting. In terms of managing our relations with the two, it's very positive that the two have gradually started to mend relations after the Galwan Valley tragedy in 2020, particularly right now in 2025, where we see them both meeting and shaking each other's hand, acting with great camaraderie in Tianjin. That is a positive. But in terms of incidents where things haven't quite gone our way, I would look back at the decision that the Sri Lankan government took with regard to the moratorium that was imposed on foreign research vessels. And I've written about this as well. What was interesting, if you might recall, a few years ago, was the arrival of Chinese research vessels, often dubbed by the Western scholars as spy ships,
Okay.
into our waters, which had created some degree of consternation and upset in Indian and American policy circles, to the extent that Sri Lankan government was in a bit of a hard place in terms of whether they grant the Chinese research vessel an okay to enter our waters or not. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the time resolved the issue by essentially making a request of the Chinese research vessel to turn off the equipment, turn on their AIS, which is the automatic identification system, and not engage in any research activity in Sri Lankan waters. And that was a compromise that we had between India and China, India and America and China, in terms of allowing the research vessel to come in. Because, in fact, with regard to that particular research vessel, it was the former or previous government that granted permission. It was a new government in place that had to deal with the problem.
Yeah.
And that was a compromise that was reached. But of course, India wasn't quite happy about it. But that is how we've sort of managed our relations whenever either party didn't necessarily see eye to eye.
As in a case study, when it comes to 2017 in Hambantota Port, which was an ideal thing, which was a deal with the Chinese government, and also back then the India Trincomalee oil thing. So in that case, particular thing, how did Sri Lanka kind of manage both of them? Like, since you told like China didn't come for the maritime regimes and all, in that particular time, what happened? Like,
Okay, so let me just pick on the Hambantota deal, as you say. With regard to the Hambantota port, what happened was Sri Lanka at that particular period of time had a lot of debt that it needed to pay back, particularly in terms of international sovereign bonds. And as a consequence, the government at the time wanted to find a way to obtain, acquire a quick influx of money. And at the time, some of the most important non performing assets of the government was the Hambantota port. So it looked at the time at potential companies and countries that were interested in taking up operations of the Hambantota port. If I'm not mistaken, they first reached out to India.
yeah,
And that didn't necessarily work out because that runs counter to the Sagar policy where India is trying to develop its own port. So then we reached out to China, and the CM Merchant Port Holdings was the organization that decided to take up a 99-year lease at a cost of 1.12 billion, if I'm not mistaken, to take up operations of the Hambantota port. Now, with regard to that, the fact still remains that we reached out to India first. When that didn't work out, we then moved to China. And I think both parties understood the dire circumstances that Sri Lanka was in at the time. Because of the high loan repayment that was coming in the years ahead, I think both parties were well aware that Sri Lanka is on the throes of a default, although maybe public weren't aware of the degree of problem that Sri Lanka was facing. The government was definitely aware, which is why they decided to lease it for 99 years. And I might add, there are many other ports and terminals across the world, including the Darwin port, that was leased for 99 years to a Chinese company, Darwin port being in Australia,
yeah.
right? So there are many other ports and port infrastructure that have been leased by China or that China has played a major role in developing across the world. That includes ports in Greece as well, right? The Piraeus port in Greece as well. So the Hambantota port is a very interesting case study because it was taken up by the West as the poster boy or poster child, whichever term you want to use, as the debt trap
Oh,
case.
the debt trap. Yeah.
But that's not necessarily true, because once you look at the evidence tells a very different picture. And a lot of economists here have talked about the misnomer or the problem in depicting the Hambantota Port as a debt trap case study, because it doesn't necessarily add up with regard to the facts. But Western scholarship has sort of taken it and run, and as a consequence, there's this narrative surrounding Hambantota Port, which is not necessarily very accurate. But in terms of managing the two, we have tried in the past to manage bilateral relations between the two, particularly when it comes to sensitive issues. If you might recall, even when the current president came to power, his first visit was to India. And in that visit, President AKD basically stated that his intention is to not take any measure that might upset the security interests of India, which is a policy that Sri Lankan governments have often adopted in the past as well. So we've managed to thread a line, I would say, and we've been doing it relatively effectively. But there have been points where both parties haven't been very satisfied at our balancing game, so to say.
All right, so that was a quite interesting answer, because like when it comes to you spoke like about the global sports as well, and that was pretty much interesting. Thank you so much. And also, I would be diving into it about the trade partners with about Japan and India, currently in Sri Lanka. So basically, Japan is also one of the biggest trading partners in Sri Lanka, and now when you cross India, it has been the second largest global economy trading partner. So when it comes to that, how are we supposed to balance as a nation, as a country? How are we supposed to balance all the imports from Japan? And when it comes to India, all these narratives, how are we supposed to, like, how can we avoid the situation? I would say, like, when it comes to, as I said earlier, the Indian imports and also the flood, the markets and all, and also the export struggle that we're having during the compete. So, what do you think about all of that?
Yes, the world is largely moving towards a more protectionist stance. And that is rather troubling for countries like Sri Lanka, because we earn a lot of revenue from our exports. Jobs are directly dependent on our exports. And this includes both manufactured products, apparels, garments, as well as agricultural products like tea. So, increasing protectionism across the world is quite troubling, particularly the concern that Sri Lanka has, I believe, is that the American decision to move towards a tariff policy through the Liberation Day tariffs that they impose across the board might set a precedent on other countries to follow the same position. That's the concern I think that Sri Lanka has. And it's fortuitous for Sri Lanka that the island has moved, or rather understood, maybe is a better way of terming this, has understood the possibility that the world might be protectionist in the future and move towards free trade agreements. If you recall, Sri Lanka moved towards discussions in terms of finalizing a free trade agreement with Thailand and Singapore quite recently, building on the free trade agreement that we had previously signed with India and Pakistan a few decades ago. We've also moved towards engaging and hoping to finalize free trade agreements with India, China, Vietnam. Currently, negotiations are going on with regard to Bangladesh and Indonesia, if I'm not mistaken. So Sri Lanka is moving towards signing free trade agreements with the hope that they'll be able to at least mitigate some of the negative effects of this protectionist stance that a lot of countries are adopting. But it's quite concerning that the world is gradually shifting towards a more protectionist position. And in terms of balancing our trade relations, we've had historically very good relations with Japan, India, as well as with China. In the past, we've made some mistakes with regard to Japan. If you recall, the decision to suddenly stop the light rail project that the Japanese wanted
Oh
to
yeah,
construct
back
here.
in the days.
Mistakes of that nature were very unfortunate. We're trying to recommence discussions around that, and hopefully that works out, because, as many of our listeners might be aware, our public transportation system in Sri Lanka is absolutely horrendous.
Yes.
It has essentially stayed stuck for the last, I don't know, 40, 50 years. Particularly if you compare countries like Singapore, they've moved years, decades, maybe centuries ahead in terms of their public transportation system. Whereas Sri Lanka, it's been stuck in time. So projects of that nature are very important. And personally, I was hoping for some sort of public public transportation MOU with India and China in our recent visits. Unfortunately, I did not see that
Okay.
materialize, but hopefully in the future we'll be able to bring them on board in terms of improving our infrastructure, which, to be honest, is in a very bad state, particularly our public infrastructure. So, in terms of balancing relations, we've done that quite well. Our relations with Japan are gradually on the rise again, as with India and China. And roughly speaking, I think our foreign policy is doing good.
Okay, that's very like quite reliable and also it's very understanding. So basically, since you mentioned about Vietnam as an example, I would bring up like when it comes to Vietnam, it also balanced when the India China both they like India and Japan. I'm sorry, India and Japan they like balance both of those. So since we are also an Asian country and Vietnam being a South Asian country,
Southeast Asia.
Southeast Asia. I'm really sorry. So basically, because of that, what do you think? Like, could we comparing with Vietnam? Are we in a place that we also could balance like Vietnam, or
So, as I mentioned, Sri Lanka has a lot of lessons that they can learn. We can learn from Vietnam in terms of how effective Vietnam has been in terms of balancing America and China in particular. Vietnam shares a border with China. China has in the past engaged quite aggressively against Vietnam in the Cold War. But Vietnam has built a very close rapport with China and has very importantly brought in American investors into the country. Vietnam is a major trading partner of several of these countries, both in Southeast Asia and across the world. So, Vietnam has done a very effective job balancing. And I think a very important lesson Sri Lanka can learn from Vietnam is the importance of policy stability.
okay?
When governments change, or policy tends to change, and that's very unfortunate. We need to have what I would call a bipartisan, or at least a multipartisan consensus around certain key policy postures that are relayed to the public, so that both domestic and international, so that potential investors know that the policy of the government will not change if and when an election comes about. And I think Vietnam's policy stability is very important for Sri Lanka to learn from. Not saying that Sri Lanka needs to be a communist nation like Vietnam, but have some sense of policy stability so that potential investors are encouraged to get involved in Sri Lanka. Significant portions of our revenue right now is generated through tourism. I think investor investment in particular has a more important role to play in the decades ahead.
Okay.
We've seen our skyline in Colombo, for example, changing. If you go to Golf Face, the entire landscape is very different. But I think investment in other parts of the island could also be encouraged if we have policy stability. Investors are looking for that, and a lot of investors at the present moment have parked a lot of money in Vietnam and several other Southeast Asian countries. We should make a bid for that money, I think. But unfortunately, policy stability is not part of the lexicon in Sri Lanka's political culture, so that needs to change, I think.
I mean, that was a kind of a difficult question, and also I felt like I mean about the stability and foreign policy and everything. It's kind of thing like when Sri Lanka's governments change, the policies change as well. But then again, as you said, sir, it should be like very stabilized and it should be very common. So, and I would dive into the China's maritime footprint, if you don't mind. Like when it's come to China, it's the presence in the Indian Ocean. It has been a grown thing right now at the moment, and also as I spoke back in the time about Hambantota Port. Like some say it's like Hambantota Port is one of the main things and it's what a growth about it. And other part of the country says like it could be a failure, it could be worse because having China to invest in our country would be like China probably kind of I would say I mean like kind of taking round or maybe probably like will go back into the British government kind of thing. The some of them think like that, but then again, sir, like, what do you think when it comes to all this foothold and everything? If the Indian Ocean, like, if China comes back to the Indian Ocean, what kind of challenges that would be faced? Whether it will be worse or whether it will be success or whether it will be marginalized in the long run of Sri Lanka.
Okay. So, in terms of China's growing footprint in the Indian Ocean, China in past few years have gradually increased their presence in the Indian Ocean region. And I think that has caused some concern among Quad nations that are part of this sort of grouping: the United States of America, Australia, India, and Japan. And with regard to India in particular, it's imperative that we remember we fall within, roughly speaking, the security perimeter of India. And as a consequence, we've got to manage our relations with India and China very carefully. China's presence in the Indian Ocean region has, I think I mentioned the research vessel situation to you
Yeah, you
earlier,
did
has
earlier.
caused concern in the past. So, what I believe Sri Lanka should be doing right now is understanding the interest of India and China with regard to the Indian Ocean region, reaching out to them diplomatically, politically, and militarily, and more importantly, I think build some sort of consensus bipartisanly, multi party, through a consensus about the approach that the island should adopt with regard to India and China. And a good scenario of this is the decision by the former government to impose a moratorium. So the argument of the moratorium was, the background or the context of it was essentially that the influx of Chinese research vessels caused some consternation among Washington and New Delhi. And as a consequence, the Sri Lankan government faced pressure from those two sides and decided, you know what, let's just impose a moratorium, no research vessels.
Okay.
And then very quickly we broke that by allowing a German research vessel to come into our waters, which then led the Chinese ambassador to be a bit upset. So, what I think we should be doing, rather than impose a moratorium, is have a standard operating procedure with regard to how research vessels are going to be treated, what is okay, what is unacceptable behavior by research vessels in our waters. And I think an SOP of that nature is very important. We've had discussions about this quite a bit in terms of drafting this,
Okay.
but we haven't seen anything yet. Governments have changed, and still the SOP is part of that drafting process. So I think something needs to happen in terms of expediting that process, particularly because the fact remains China will have a major presence in the Indian Ocean region. That's a fact because a lot of its trade comes across through the Indian Ocean region, right? So oil exports that are coming from the Middle East or West Asia cross our waters, across the sea lane of communication, and reach East Asia and parts of China. So the whole argument that China does not need a presence in the Indian Ocean is moot because of the significant trading presence as well as China's interest in developing infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative across
Yeah.
the Indian Ocean landscape. So I think it's very important that we understand the reality or the ground reality, enhance our ties with India, but at the same time, recognize the important role that China is playing in the Indian Ocean region and figure out what type of policy Sri Lanka should adopt to further its national interest by balancing the two.
I want to ask you about this Djibouti thing, where the Djibouti handled China's military base like really nicely. I mean, very completely. But then again, if that happens to Sri Lanka, how will Sri Lanka manage, or how will Sri Lanka be able to
Right.
compete? Because I'll make it like Sri Lanka, like how Sri Lanka has managed Hambantota so far. Because like I've been keeping up taking Hambantota for a while, but then again, when I go back to Djibouti, that I could bring up the thing is only Hambantota back again. So what would you say that about?
Sure. So, at that initial moment where Sri Lanka leased the Hambantota Port for 99 years, a lot of Indian and Western observers argued there might be a possibility of dual use. In other words, that Hambantota might be used, although it's now a commercial port, might be used for military purposes by the Chinese government, and that was a concern that they expressed. And to allay those concerns, the then government decided to move the Southern Naval Command to Hambantota, simply to show that the port is necessarily within our parameters in terms of security. Coming back to the question of Djibouti, Djibouti is a very interesting case study because it's not just the Chinese who have built a base there. Americans have a naval base there, if I'm not mistaken. The French also have a naval base there. So Djibouti has been sort of managing bases for quite some time. I don't think that's the best answer in terms of the policy Sri Lanka should adopt, because adopting bases or bases like, say, the Okinawa base the Americans have in Japan is not the approach that Sri Lanka should take because it necessarily impinges on the security interests of India. And I don't think the Sri Lankan public would look favorably towards an Indian base here either, right? So I think Vietnam's approach, since we took
Yeah.
Vietnam, in terms of the four no's, one no is no foreign bases in their country. And I think that's an important no that we should adopt as well. Um, Having no foreign bases sticks to or helps the island stick to its non-aligned foreign policy. I think that's very important in the years ahead because although some observers say non-alignment is dead as a foreign policy approach, I beg to differ because I think it's still very relevant in a multipolar world order where countries are trying to pressure and influence small island states like ours. So, having no foreign bases essentially depicts or portrays Sri Lanka in a way in which we are non aligned. We don't want to be involved in your geopolitical contestation. We want to reap maximum benefits from the two of you in terms of economy. And we are very happy as you play along, but we don't want to be involved. And having a no base policy, I think, very much fits in line with that overall approach. So I think that's a lesson, another lesson
Another
that Sri
lesson
Lanka could
to
learn
learn.
from Vietnam.
Okay, so thank you. And also, I would dive into the global conflicts, whether when it comes to Russian-Ukraine war, which is like, I'm not going to say it's interesting because it's very, it's disappointing to see another war happening out there, and again, Palestine as well. But then again, I'll bring up back to Russia and Ukraine. So when it comes to that hitting up directly in when it comes to fuel prices, food prices, and even fertilizers, if I'm not mistaken, how does that war kind of reshape Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka's economy, and also like the diplomacy of Sri Lanka, and also like how do you think it that we could handle that base in Sri Lanka?
Okay. So, with regard to the war in Ukraine or the Russian, I would tell me the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Sri Lanka has adopted a very interesting stance. Coming back to trade, since we talked about trade for quite a bit,
Yes.
Sri Lanka's trade with Ukraine was cut by about a third as a consequence of the breakout of war in 2022. So, Sri Lanka has had significant trade level or economic implications or impacts from that. Trade, on the other hand, with Russia actually increased in the years later, but that's a separate case altogether. Both are very important trading partners for Sri Lanka, and as a consequence of the Russia Ukraine war, prices of particularly agricultural products we saw rose. And that has had knock on effects, I would argue, on the Sri Lankan economy as well. Sri Lanka, as a NAM nation, would very much like the cessation of conflict between the two and has played an important role within the United Nations in terms of spurring dialogue on how this can be resolved. With regard to the possibility that is resolved, I think that very much lies in the hands of the Russian president. And if the Russian president wishes to end conflict in terms of adopt some sort of resolution to the conflict in the lines of what was mooted when he visited President Trump in Anchorage, Alaska, maybe the entire thing will essentially end. But we don't quite know. And what's concerning for me, particularly as an observer of what's happening around the world, is that in the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit that was held a few days ago, there was actually no mention about a cessation of hostilities despite those talks that had been happening in the weeks ahead. So, President Zelensky, if you remember, President Zelensky and European leaders went to meet Trump. Before that, he met the Russian president in Alaska. And there was this hype around, or this hope, rather, I would argue, this hope around a possibility that this could finally end. It doesn't appear so. And I think the cards that the US president can play at the moment to pressure President Putin to agree to some sort of resolution seems to have ended. I don't think he has any cards any longer.
Yeah.
Which is why, in a previous interview, I argued that India and the 50% tariff that was imposed on India for India purchasing Russian oil, India was essentially an unfortunate sort of third party that had to be involved here because of Trump's inability to pressure President Putin any longer. So it's very concerning. By the looks of it at the moment, I don't think a resolution will come in the weeks, probably months ahead. We hope that some sort of resolution might come about, but I don't see anything of the sort coming in the future. With regard to the conflict that is taking place, you mentioned the Hamas Israel
Yeah.
conflict as well. I think once again Sri Lanka has played an interesting role there. Sri Lanka has historically and continues to support a two-state solution. Sri Lanka continues to support Palestinian statehood, and we, if I'm not mistaken, in 2024 gave close to $1 million in aid to Palestinian refugees.
Okay.
Right, the government actually organized that. If I'm not mistaken, it was a million USD, and actions of that nature has continued to take place by different organizations and charities in Sri Lanka. So we want once again a resolution to the conflict. We have important trading relations also, and a sizable portion of our workforce actually works in Israel. So
Yeah.
the two parties are very important in that political sense, right? So Sri Lanka has tried to not necessarily pick a side. Sri Lanka has continued to strive for a two-state solution, and I think hopefully that might end in the coming months. Because if I'm not mistaken, Israel recently announced that the final stage of the operations are underway to take out Hamas leaders. A few days ago, we saw Israel attacking Yemen and taking out Houthi leaders. And gradually, it seems to be the case that Israel is taking out some of the top tier ranks, and hopefully that conflict might end altogether. But again, I remain hopeful with that conflict ending in the weeks or months ahead. But with regard to Russia and Ukraine, I think a lot of agency lies in President Trump. Sorry, President Putin.
Putin.
And I think President Trump has played all of his cards at the moment.
Oh, okay. We spoke quite much. Are we balancing onto great powers? As I said, like Sri Lanka has casually been balancing relationships, as you said, so about US, China, and India. So too much tilt and one way, we risk kind of losing the other at some times. From in your view, what is the smartest way of to manage this balancing? Can you think a moment in history back in the days, like whether Sri Lanka was succeed or was it failed at times?
Right. A good historical analogy of success was when SWRD Bandaranaike came to power in 19. So when he came to power, interestingly, he was very effective in getting assistance both from the Soviet camp as well as the American camp. With regard to the Soviet camp, he decided to open up relations with the Soviet bloc, several countries of the Soviet bloc, and that enabled Sri Lanka to access a lot of economic assistance from the Soviet bloc as well. So that's cases where things worked out. Cases where things didn't work out, I would argue, was a 2010 to 2015 period, where Sri Lanka very clearly, after the war, tilted towards China at the expense of India. And as a result, pressure, particularly in the Human Rights Council, increased substantially. And incidentally, in the coming few days, Sri Lanka will have to face the same sort of scenario at UNHRC. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the Sri Lankan president will be talking to the General Assembly as well in terms of postulating the progress that has been made under his government and Sri Lanka in terms of human rights altogether. So I think situations where that hasn't worked was 2010 to 2015. And as a consequence of that tilt towards China, we had faced quite a lot of pressure from Western countries in terms of the Chogam, for example, that was held in 2014. Resoundingly, I would argue, was a failure because of so many leaders deciding to opt out of not coming the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. I would argue, although the government at the time viewed it as a positive, as a bit of an embarrassment, right? So situations like that are very important, I think, to take into consideration, where if we tilt towards one party, as you correctly pointed out, that is often at the expense of the others.
Yeah.
And the others would not stay still.
Yeah.
Right? And Sri Lanka is very much vulnerable to any sort of pressure that comes from these countries because of our reliance on maintaining existing economic relations with these countries. In terms of our major source of imports, tourists, investment, it's India and China.
Yeah. That's
a fundamental fact. In terms of most of our exports, that's the European Union and the United States. So we've got a very difficult balancing role to play. And unless we play things right, if we tilt to one side, the economy and the public in total suffer.
Yeah, so basically, since you mentioned about the like the tales and all. Like, if I'm not mistaken, during the Rajapaksa regime, like it was more heavy tilt into the China, while the Sirisena's government, which is the Yahapal, if I'm not mistaken, was also rebalancing India and the West as well, right? So in that scenario, so what do you think about the current government?
Right. In terms of the current government, I think I alluded to this at the beginning. Our first visit was to India,
Yeah.
and the Indian Prime Minister came to Sri Lanka as well. We've also, our second visit was to China. So we've kind of started playing the two. With regard to balancing our relations with the two, I think we've done quite well. I was a little bit upset because of the lack of representation by Sri Lanka at the SEO summit. I think the government should have sent a representative at a high level to the summit, ideally the foreign minister or someone above. But I think, roughly speaking, we've done quite well in terms of balancing our relations, and particularly at a moment in time where we are engaged in this debt restructuring, it's imperative that we maintain good relations with all parties concerned. And right now, the image that foreign investors and foreigners in total see of Sri Lanka is rather positive, and that's good. But I think as that geopolitical competition heats up, and if down the line maybe relations between India and China sour, it's imperative that one, we are aware of this, and two, we know what to do. Because if we tilt once again towards one side at the expense of the other, that will have grave ramifications. And it's very interesting because fundamentally, when you look at the current government, it's the National People's Power, but it's essentially built around the backbone of the JVP, which has historically had a very anti-India stance, and all of that sort of changed when the government came to power, realizing that that historic ideological position can no longer be espoused once you are in power. So that's a very positive thing, I think, that should be taken by Indian observers, because a traditionally left leaning political party that had very strong ideological positions against India, particularly with regard to India's involvement in Sri Lanka in the 80s and 90s, had decided, you know what, once we're part of this coalition government of the NPP, we need to recalibrate, we need to understand that India is very important, and first visit was to India.
Yeah, and they're just balancing both of them right now.
Exactly.
Yeah, so like to wrap it up, I'll get into climate change, which is one of the most global trends at the moment, and how it will kind of impact in Sri Lanka's future as well. So basically, when it comes to climate change, rising above sea levels, extreme floods, what's happening around the world and Sri Lanka too, and about the droughts, what's happening. Uh, I mean, those are so many threats around, and they're already in Sri Lanka as well. Like, how do you think climate change can will kind of like shape Sri Lanka's development sector on the next decade or the 20 or decades ahead? And like, should we still stay ahead, and should we also like looking toward forward about the climate change?
Right. So, of course, I'm no necessary expert on climate change per
Yeah.
se, but from my observations, I think climate change is a very important existential challenge that Sri Lanka and many other countries face, and unfortunately, there isn't sufficient global attention on this. We have a U.S. president that does not believe in climate change.
Yeah.
We have emerging economies that are paying less and less attention to meeting their obligations that they set out in COP25, COP15 on. So that, for me, I think is very concerning. For small islands like ours, we emit, I think, less than 0.001 of greenhouse gases of GHG. So the impact that Sri Lanka can make is very small
Yeah,
in terms of
like
changing our policy.
yeah, but then again, so like if you take the Asia, which is Bangladesh, one of the neighbors, like it success with climate change when it comes to agriculture, if I'm not mistaken, and also when it comes to Maldives, they use the renewable energy. So what can we do? Like,
Yeah, I think we've broadly speaking understood the importance of moving away from more harmful forms of energy generation. But I think impetus needs to be much more. But I understand some reluctance on the matter because right now our imperative is to fix our economy
Yeah.
and then sort of move forward. I think with regard to climate change, Sri Lanka could play a more important role as a norm setting agent
All right.
to convince other governments of the imperative of doing something, particularly with regard to Pacific Island countries. They played a very important, some would argue, outsized role in pushing countries to agree to certain climate change policies or positions. And that has made an impact with regard to the position that China has made, for example. So, Pacific Island countries and their position or their posture with regard to pushing forward that agenda is very important. Lessons that Sri Lanka can learn. But fundamentally, there's very little that Sri Lanka, by its own self, can do with regard to climate change, particularly in an environment where there is trade protectionism, there is more focus on building our economy at home, the MAGA movement
Yeah.
onward. So, in that type of environment, the focus on climate change is
Less.
right? And
The
that's
topic
quite
is
concerning.
very less in Sri Lanka. Is that what you're trying to say? Yeah.
Not just in Sri Lanka, but globally. And
Globally.
that has implications on Sri Lanka because we face a lot of natural disasters
Yeah.
as a consequence of maybe other activities happening elsewhere, right? For example, a lot of people in Colombo in certain weeks and months complained about the smog. This
Yeah.
is not our smog,
Yeah.
right?
True. True.
So I think we are aware of the implications of climate change in terms of impacting us on the ground, but we need to be doing more, I think, in terms of pushing other countries to adhere to the norms and guidelines that they set out in their pledges and promises at COP meetings. And maybe we have a more important role to play there. Maybe we should. But at the moment, I think most of our attention, most of our energy is focused on fixing our economy first.
All right, sir. Thank you so much. And also, sir, do you have any add-ons to about the global trends that's happening around Sri Lanka that would benefit in this topic at this moment?
Yeah, I think one thing that is very important for me to add to our existing discussion
Yes.
is the importance of Sri Lankans to be aware of what's happening.
Yeah.
Because everyone likes to talk about, analyze, but no one likes to sit down, read, and make sense of things. And there's a lot of information out there on the internet in terms of podcasts like what we're doing right now and internationally as well. But engagement is very less. And I think it's very important that Sri Lankans, on the one hand, the government is pushing for financial literacy. I would add another plank to that policy, which is let's increase our awareness about global events and developments and how that impacts Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important. I think there's a lot of interest in like what's happening with America's foreign policy, but students, and I've been teaching here in Sri Lanka for 6 years and more, and students are more aware of maybe what Trump tweeted or what Trump put on Truth Social rather than the government's policy in Sri Lanka about a certain issue. And I think it's important to sort of know both, right? First, know what's happening around the world, but don't necessarily just pay attention in America. Pay attention to other important countries, both in our region and elsewhere. And also, as Sri Lankan citizens, be more aware of what's happening at home. So that's sort of my only broadly speaking request that I think is important to say out or put out at this
All
point in time.
right. Thank you so much, sir, for being here with us today. And also, uh, let's hope for having another podcast very soon. So, yes, sir. Thank you so much. for
Thank you
joining.
very much for inviting me on it. Thank you.
Thank you.